And go ahead, Peggy, begin.
Okay, thank you, Bob. And hello, friends and neighbors. It's good to see all of you, even if remotely. So as I think you all are aware, we have another recent reason for concern, and that was the passage of the accessory dwelling unit ordinance. And what that has done for me is forced me to go back and look at the background about why these issues are continuing to come up in the city of Gainesville, to try to better understand how we might position our neighborhood and maybe the community at large as we begin to try to shape policy that's evolving. So what I've done is to go back and look at the trends, and I'm going to, let me go back. I'm going to share my screen with you. Let me see if this will, let's see. Okay, are you seeing that?
That's working, yes.
Okay, let me go to enlarging. All right, so I'll try to move through this quickly because when we get to Kim, she's going to talk more specifically about some of the recent developments. But I'd like to cover the following topics. I'd like to address the issue of fairness as it relates to housing, sustainability, affordability, and then talk a little specifically about the accessory dwelling units ordinance, and then talk about the changes that appear to be in the wind in the city of Gainesville. So first of all, when it comes to fairness, I think you all are all probably very well aware that in 1968, the Fair Housing Act was passed. And what this required was the administration of housing related programs in a manner to affirmatively further fair housing. And of course, it was actually sponsored by Mondale. And at the time, it lacked a lot of definition and a lot of specificity, but over time that has begun to be added. So one of the first points where there was some specificity added was in 1994, when the Housing and Urban Development developed a rule that required specifically an analysis of the impediments to fair housing, and then a mandate that people or local governments act appropriately to overcome those impediments. In 1996, HUD interpreted their rules even further, and this is one of the places where the idea of inclusivity comes in. So they felt that it was important to provide opportunities for inclusive patterns of housing, regardless of race, color, religion, etc. So that was they were the first few steps in time as these policies evolved. But I'd like to specifically get to 2015, when a pretty aggressive rule was adopted by HUD as a way to promote fair housing. And it required an analysis, including an analysis of zoning and land use laws for people who are going to be applying for HUD funding. And as part of that too, applicants would have to prove that they were actually promoting fair housing. So there was considerable resistance to how far this rule went by a lot of local governments. And actually, just in August of 2020, under the current administration, there has been a new HUD decision made, and it's called Preserving Community and Neighborhood Choice.
Yes.
The points that are made about it, if we look at it in a very general way, are, first of all, it goes quite far in trying to preserve local control as opposed to federal intervention in local decision-making about housing and housing policy. And then it includes some definitions. So they define affirmatively furthering fair housing as fair housing means it's affordable, safe, decent, free from lawful discrimination, and accessible as required under civil rights law. And to affirmatively further means to take any action rationally related to promoting any attribute of fair housing. So again, since 1968, what seems to be happening is a further definition, but really in a lot of ways, I'd say the debate at the federal level depends on the degree to which the federal government's going to define what local governments do, or whether local governments are going to maintain their autonomy in their decision making. So with that as a background, these next two slides are slides that came from the City Commission's presentation in August 31st, where they discussed exclusionary zoning. And just for reading it, but it says exclusionary zoning or practices originally created for the purpose of tacitly excluding racial minorities by segregating neighborhoods along economic, social, and racial lines. It goes on to explain that these practices are no longer explicit in their intent to maintain racial segregation, but they continue to serve as the biggest hurdle to racial integration, access to schools, wealth that accrues from home ownership, et cetera. So this is essentially the working definition that our city is using when they use the phrase exclusionary zoning. And at that same meeting, in the same presentation, they went on to share this slide, which talks about the issues related to exclusionary zoning. But I guess specifically, let's look at the pink box, if you will, where they're discussing solutions. So they feel that ways to address this notion of exclusionary zoning are to change regulations to allow more diverse housing types, which includes accessory dwelling units and duplexes, reduce the minimum lot requirements to accommodate opportunities for new housing, and support regulatory changes aimed at building attainable housing in high opportunity areas. So we'll come back to those in a little more specificity. So after that 2015 rule, when the Obama administration was in power, they also developed a housing development toolkit. And in that toolkit, they had some specific actions that they thought local government should be taking in order to move the agenda forward. And so let me just run through this list. These are terms that we were all been hearing of late. And again, I hope maybe it clarifies some of them for you, as it did for me as I began to look at it. So first of all, they promoted the notion of establishing by right development. And essentially what this said is that if the zoning classification or the land use classification would allow a specific sort of development, it wouldn't require much public input. It essentially could be reviewed and addressed by staff. And essentially this is what we've seen with the Seminary Lane project that's being challenged, and Kim will talk more about that. It also suggested streamlining other permitting processes, whether it's stormwater or parking or those sorts of things. And the goal here is not so much to eliminate public input, but to try to reduce the cost of new development with the hopes that it would keep housing less costly, reduce the price. Eliminate off-street parking requirements for that same reason. That boosts the cost of development. Enact higher density multifamily zoning where possible. Allow accessory dwelling units. Establish density bonuses. For example, if you provide affordable housing units, you might get some sort of a density bonus. And we saw some of this with the proposed GNV rise 2 years ago. And then sort of broadly employ inclusionary zoning. So these are examples of the kinds of policy changes that are being promoted to try to address this idea of fairness. And clearly we're seeing the city of Gainesville moving in that direction. So when under the topic of fairness, let me just leave you with this question, and maybe this will stimulate some conversation when we have a minute. And that is single family housing inherently unfair? And we'll just leave it at that for the moment. The next broad topic I want to address is the notion of sustainability. So one of the other reasons that we're seeing a push to go beyond simple single family residential areas is there's a sense that we need to do what we can to increase densities in order to make cities more livable and to make them more sustainable, and particularly to promote the idea of walkability. So there's a group, a notion about this missing middle housing. And it's considered to be the range of house scale buildings with multiple units that sort of fit between the detached single family and the multifamily that you see in larger urban areas. And so the housing types that are included in this missing middle concept include duplexes, fourplexes, courtyard buildings, cottage courts, etc., on up to slightly more dense kinds of housing types. And again, the primary motivation here is sustainability, trying to increase the walkability and access to the entire community, but it also does have a affordability element to it. So on the affordability piece, as looking at the second bullet, actually, the notion again of diversity of housing stock. So the concept here is that if solutions along a spectrum of affordability are provided, i.e. the missing middle housing types, that has the potential to reduce the price of housing across the community and therefore make it more accessible to more people. But there's also the notion, and we heard our mayor practically say this verbatim in the discussion about the accessory dwelling unit, but the fact that some people believe that one of the ways to lower the cost of housing is simply to increase the amount of housing stock. And again, this seems to be a direction that some of the policies that are being proposed by the city is taking. So specifically about the accessory dwelling units, just in case some of you aren't entirely familiar with this, again, this slide is from the presentation that the staff made to the City Commission on the first reading of the ordinance on August 20th. And it describes the kinds of accessory dwelling units that might be provided, and including an attached accessory dwelling unit that's internal to an existing structure, an attached accessory dwelling unit via an addition, or in fact, a detached accessory dwelling unit, which could be a freestanding building on the same parcel with a single family residence. And this table simply compares the original staff's draft with what the plan board recommended when they reviewed the proposed ordinance, and then what the Hayes-Santos amendments did to the ordinance, using three measures to look at the comparison, to create the comparison. So first of all, as far as height goes, in the original ordinance as drafted by staff, they proposed 1.5 stories as a maximum height. The plan board proposed to change that to 2, and Hayes-Santos amendment recommended simply making it consistent with whatever the zoning classification was in which the ADU would be added. As far as the number of units, the staff's original recommendation was 1. The plan boards went along with that, 1 ADU, and in the Hayes-Santos amendments, it got doubled up to 2, with 1 attached and 1 detached units being allowed. And then finally, maybe the most radical change was about whether owner occupancy would be required. And in the original draft by staff, it was to be required. In the plan board recommended eliminating that. And I've talked with one of the plan board members, and one of the reasons that they recommended that is they felt it would be difficult to manage over time as a house sold? How would they ensure that the resident could or would use the ADU? So they felt that was a bit cumbersome, and that was one of the rationales for it. And obviously, when Hayes Santos made his amendments, that notion of eliminating the owner occupancy requirement was passed. And as you know, the vote when the ADU ordinance change was made on second reading, it passed 4-3. So finally, I just wanted to suggest to you that there's some additional policy changes in the wind within the city of Gainesville. As I think most of you are well aware, we have really tried our very best to get codes enforcement to enforce the fact that only 3 unrelated persons are allowed in a unit, in a single family unit. We haven't been terribly successful with this, but this was again a code that was established with great effort by Mark Goldstein and others of you for several years ago. Another policy change that we think is coming is we probably are going to see a return to the housing options that were originally proposed as part of GNB Rise. For example, trying to move forward availability of adding missing middle housing types in single family neighborhoods. And then finally, again, one specific notion that seems to be out there is if we can reduce minimum lot sizes in single family neighborhoods, that will reduce the cost and therefore may make some of those kinds of housing opportunities more affordable to people in our city. So I hope this helps you with an overview. I felt like it was important to understand where the impetus was coming from for all these changes. And I found it useful to go back and look at this over time. So with that, let me turn it over to Kim. And then I guess we'll eventually get to questions, time permitting.
Yeah, we got some flex in the schedule. This is an important topic, so please go ahead, Kim.
Okay, thank you. So Peggy asked me to talk perhaps about the Seminary Lane student housing project specifically, as well as about some of the data that perhaps is guiding the city's decision making. And I can talk about that in more detail during the question and answer if you'd like. But what I'd like to do actually is to zoom out and think about what's going on in the city of Gainesville. So my talk will have 2 parts: what is going on in the city of Gainesville, and in my view, what should be going on in the city of Gainesville. And I'm going to start with an anecdote. I arrived in Gainesville in about 1990 and attended a party. And like you do at parties, I asked the person I was speaking with what he did for a living. And he told me he was a farmer. And then with a sly smile, he said, "I grow Yankees, 6 to the acre." That was my first understanding of a phenomena that exists in Florida that I did not know from my previous work as an architect in North Carolina, which is that development, taking and commoditizing land is something that's done in Florida to a degree that I haven't seen done in other places that I've lived. And I think that's very key to what we're talking about, and really a kind of a good segue from what Peggy explained from another point of view. Fast forward to 2020, and I think what we're seeing in Gainesville is developers or wannabe developers who also want to be farmers, except that rather than growing Yankees 6 to the acre, they want to grow renters 24 to the acre, and soon 80 to the acre, or even 160 to the acre, such as in the most recent Depot Park upzoning proposal. What I think we're seeing, and I think the reason many of us are so flummoxed by what's going on in Gainesville, is what I would describe as irrational exuberance at both ends of the housing spectrum in Gainesville. We have, on the one hand, large student apartment complexes that are measured by the bed, not by the unit, but by the bed. And that would include the Seminary Lane project, which is in the heart of one of Gainesville's most historic African American communities, with 400 something apartments and 850 beds. And the way it's defined in Gainesville, the way it was approved, is by the bed, not even by the living unit. So on the one hand, we have huge student apartment complexes, certainly larger than anything that's been seen in Gainesville, and at the outer edge of what I've seen looking at some of these things nationally. On the other end, at the small end of the scale, we have people interested, intent on turning, and this includes our some of our commissioners and the folks who call into meetings in support of those agendas, who are trying to turn single family neighborhoods into multi-family neighborhoods. And that would be measured in units per acre. So essentially, as Peggy was describing, if every single family plot of land becomes a threeplex, that means that in Gulfview, which is now RSF4, 8 units to the acre, it becomes 24 units to the acre immediately. So we're just increasing the farming of rental units in this way. I happen to be watching television. I'm calling in from Missouri today. And in Southwest Missouri, there was a loan, an advertisement for a loan company on television the other day. And it was a young woman speaking. And as she spoke about getting a loan for her home, there were images of it. And she was standing in her kitchen, which had new stainless steel appliances and so forth. And her tagline was that she turned her single family home into a multifamily home. And implied in that was that in turning her single family home into a multifamily home, she was able to roll in a new kitchen for herself in the process. So I think that's one of the phenomena that we're hearing about as people are calling into our city commission meetings, is people who are trying to monetize their residences in that way. The other thing that I have seen cross my radar in recent days comes from a 2014 British architecture journal called the Architectural Review. It says how tech giant Airbnb is rewriting the rule book on domestic architecture and fueling a housing crisis. It was written in September 2014. It says, quote, "Thanks to the sharing economy, domestic space is less a private realm than a commodity." And it goes on, "In 5 years, Airbnb has repurposed an unprecedented amount of architecture around the world. What used to be the fortress of the family and the individual is now a marketable asset." And I think that what we're seeing in Gainesville is a transformation from homes as places for families or, folks who choose to live together, into a commodity, which is what the developer told me he did with land in 1990. So what's driving this effort to increase the city of Gainesville's population? Who's behind this? We've heard a number of explanations. One explanation is that there are climate refugees from Florida's coasts, especially South Florida, and that we need to provide a place for them here in Gainesville. A second explanation, which Peggy alluded to, is that our city commission has taken it upon itself to end systemic racism by ending exclusionary zoning, which is arguably connected to single family zoning. And here I would note that I am certainly aware of multifamily housing project that multifamily housing areas, including in New York City or in Gainesville, that are very segregated. So I don't think personally that the density has to do with what makes it segregated, or certainly not exclusively. But that's an explanation that's being given. Peggy also mentioned that our goal is to provide affordable housing, and we can talk about the cost of providing new housing, building new housing versus rehabbing housing. Another explanation is that, and what we hear from the people who actually do call into city commission meetings in favor of the changes that the majority of the commission is promoting. These are folks who are in their 30s, and they are essentially seeking a way to pay to live where they want to live. These are people who would like to live in a better neighborhood, better schools, whatever, in their views, but they can't afford it. But they believe that if the lots were subdivided and they could build a smaller house on a lot in an existing neighborhood, it would be affordable for them to live there. So that's another argument. The city of Gainesville has said that our population is growing. However, when I asked then planning director Wendy Thomas what the data showed, the information that she gave me shows that based on the city's own projections of growth through 2040 and the city's currently approved, circa 2019, currently approved um, um, permitted and built projects, we already have more than enough dwelling units for the people who will live here through 2040. I think all of us recognize that what's being approved and built does not match what people in our community need, and that's a real problem that we need to address. Two other things I'd like to suggest as possible explanations. One is that most of the areas under the most pressure right now have been placed into what are called opportunity zones. This is a Trump era initiative which pours money into certain neighborhoods. It's a national phenomena, and there are pretty extraordinary tax breaks, and the people who can benefit from this are basically unknown to us because the funding comes in aggregated I don't know, packages of financing. I'm not even sure what they are. I'm not sure anyone knows. But opportunity zoning, I would say, may be part of what we're looking at, opportunity zone funding. And in addition, I don't think any of us really understand the implications of other financial changes, such as banking regulations, that might lead to people developing projects in ways that haven't been done before. For instance, in the Seminary Lane project, the developer's agent is CHW, a local engineering firm. The firm that owns or that is, I would say, brokering the project is Trammell Webb, which is an Orlando-based company, but they have now sold the right to develop it to a national company or international, I don't even know, that does exclusively large-scale student housing complex building and management. So there's a kind of a chain of ownership that none of us can even begin to comprehend at this point. And I think that's part of what's going on in Gainesville. So what's really driving this effort to increase the city of Gainesville's population? Because essentially all of these various issues have the goal of increasing density in the city. And Peggy alluded to a well-intentioned reason to increase density kind of indirectly that we can talk about. When I look at what's going on and all of the explanations, they don't really fit in my mind with what we're seeing on the ground. I think what we're seeing on the ground is some winners and some losers. The winners are, of course, large-scale land speculators. These are mostly from out of town and perhaps of unknown ownership. These are the people developing the large-scale student apartment complexes in town. We also see winners among the small-scale land speculators who currently do and increasingly will purchase single-family properties and convert them to multifamily properties. The folks in this group, I would say, seem to be, and I see this in large part from Facebook posts and the few folks who call into city commission meetings. These seem to be young Gainesville knowledge workers, local young entrepreneurs, and probably increasingly out-of-town speculators, like the folks who currently own property in all of our neighborhoods. So there are winners that are small-scale land speculators and large-scale land speculators, and where perhaps the tax benefits that go with those would help drive city revenues. So who are the losers? And I think the losers are local residents who seek to live in these historic neighborhoods and who do treat them as their homes. And then shifting gears to conclude, that's what the city is doing. Someone reached out to me on Facebook recently and asked for some readings on the growth of cities across time. And that led me to pull out an old book by Spiro Kostoff. It's kind of a classic on the growth of cities. And it helped me reflect on how cities have, cities that we love across the last 400 years and around the world, what makes them great. And in looking at that, I realized that all of these efforts by our city do not lead to great cities and never have anywhere in the world. So in good cities across the globe for 4,000 years, organized societies have focused on public elements of city making, such as public squares, important buildings, the celebration of important landscape features, thoughtful and responsive infrastructure, and things that promote the health, safety, and welfare of the citizens of those cities. Here in Gainesville, the current leadership, the majority of the current leadership is focused on encouraging private developers, large and small, to change the city's fabric randomly, meaning a developer can, in a very aggressive and, in my view, predatory way, get a property upzoned. And we're seeing this happen all over and witnessed it firsthand in Seminary Lane. Just randomly based on property they do own or property that they might own, but it's being done randomly. In my view, this approach advances feral land speculation, not city design. Every good city is known for its design, not just for its density. In my view, it's an incredibly lazy approach and an abdication of the responsibility of democratic government to let developers make what they will of this community. What I think is happening right now in Gainesville is essentially taking the path of what is often described as aggressive informal settlement, in the same way that Latin American favelas emerge in a vacuum of organized effort. By taking a laissez-faire approach to the design of cities, in my view, Gainesville risks becoming the local equivalent of a developing world country. So those are my formal remarks. I can talk more at length about the Seminary Lane project, which is the most immediate example that we're seeing, but there are many more in the pipeline. There are hundreds of projects currently under consideration by the city. And I have been asked to make a pitch for a legal defense fund for the Seminary Lane project. And that's because the city and the citizens of the city are finding ourselves with the need to fight our own city government through the legal process. And so people are raising money through a PayPal account and by sending checks to Janice Gary. And I can provide her email address for you if you'd like later, because the effort needs funding. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Kim. I know there's questions, Terry, but I'd like to hold to the end and let Commissioner Johnson add her piece to it. And then I guarantee we'll have at least 15 minutes for any of your questions or comments. So Commissioner Johnson.
I was about to say, thank you, Mayor. I'm so
You
used to
promoted me big time.
meetings, and like that's the first thing that comes out of my mouth. Thank you all for having me today. So I just want to do a quick time check because it looks like we are going to leave about 15 minutes for questions.
We have flex time, and we can go to at least 4:15.
5:15. So I personally have a hard stop at 5. I personally have a hard stop at 5. So would you rather me spend a few minutes talking about the moratorium or just like launch right into question and answers?
So just go ahead with your thing about the moratorium, and then we'll have.
Okay. Okay, that sounds good. So I think the best way to approach this is to let you know what a moratorium is, why I proposed it, where we are now with it, and what's next. So a moratorium is a pause on certain types of development to be defined by policymakers in a certain geographic area. I have proposed this because I have actually lived through education. The 15 years that I was in Brooklyn, there was a very concerted effort amongst wealthy people that had a lot of influence, politicians, business improvement district, and a couple of other folks that came together around a plan that was to be that over the course of a decade would happen. And I lived through it, and it was painful. Like, it was painful to see my local bodega turn into a, coffee shop where it took you, 10 minutes to get your drip coffee. It was painful to see, a local dry cleaner go out of business so that, co-working space could come in. And I saw how people were being displaced. I saw families uprooted. I saw businesses uprooted. And I have the benefit of being able to see what this looks like for a community. And I understood when I came to Gainesville what was happening by looking and seeing that the multifamily large apartment complexes were being built in Gainesville that were primarily marketed towards students. And in Brooklyn, it was a little bit different. It was more like luxury housing. But it's the same thing, luxury housing, whether it's marketed towards students or, another group of folks. And I felt like we really needed to have this because the pressure that was happening from the growth of the university, them having in their strategic plan that they wanted students to live downtown and live close to the university and close to services. All of that over the course of, since I think 2015 was when that plan came out, I understood that there was a larger plan that I was not involved in, that communities were not involved in, that they had no say the way that their community was going to develop. So I felt like we needed to literally just pause to take stock of where we are as a community, and come up with solutions in order to make sure that everybody, yes, can live where they want to live, has access to affordable housing, has access to the services. So I do want to say that I don't disagree with there's certain parts that I disagree with my colleagues on how to get to that place of being a Gainesville where everyone can live in a neighborhood and have access to services. I don't disagree with that. It's about how we get there. And I think that it's very simplistic to me to say that we should have a plan for inclusionary zoning and exclusionary zoning without asking the 2 or 3 questions after that about, well, if you do decide to implement this, then how do you know that the people that will be able to benefit from this, the intention that will happen? Because as I see it right now, it is literally just giving the opportunity to developers to build more and take, a little bit off their balance sheet, right? And who's to say we're relying upon the benevolence of developers to then reinvest that back into the property by making it affordable housing. And unless we have something in place where we understand that that's the way it absolutely is going to work, then the outcome of that to me is disastrous. And the outcome of that means to me that we have high net worth individuals and students, and that is literally all, being able to live close to downtown and close to the university. Because if we don't have a plan in place otherwise, what's the reason? Like we live in a capitalist society, right? Like, people are here to make money. Developers are here to make money. I have not met many developers who are here to, provide affordable housing out of the goodness of their hearts.
I'm on mute.
I feel like I went off the rails there a little bit. So that is why I felt like we needed a moratorium. Where we are right now is that the commission meeting before this, staff was supposed to come back to us with an ordinance, as well as a plan for how to implement the 13 different solutions around affordable housing and gentrification, displacement, home ownership, et cetera. That didn't happen. We had a staff come back to us presented us with data that did not necessarily support a moratorium. I can talk for an hour about the data that was presented to us, why it was presented to us, and what was missing to me. But I won't go there right now. All I'll say is that the effort is on hold at the moment because of the data that was presented that does not necessarily support the moratorium. I am happy to answer any questions that you have. I deeply believe that what's going on right now is very clearly, like Kim said, she will say it better than I can say it, but the commodification of housing to increase multifamily units for the benefit of developers and not necessarily for the benefit of the community. And the question that we have to answer right now is, how do we grow our housing stock, but do it in an equitable way so that everyone can benefit from the growth that is happening in Gainesville right now? And right now, that is not the case. It clearly is very focused to me on developers.
Okay, thank you.
You ever look at Kim's hands sometimes?
I thought everybody was muted except myself and Commissioner Johnson, but what we want to do now is offer you an opportunity to ask some questions or make some comments, hopefully not long comments, but we have 15 or 20 minutes, we can do that. And early on in one of the notices, first notices about this meeting, I sent out a little sheet on Zoom etiquette for large meetings. And I would appreciate it if you'd follow that as well as during the business session later. We want everybody to have a chance to speak and to be recognized, but in Zoom, there's basically 3 ways to seek recognition. One is to simply raise your hand like this, and hold it until you're recognized, and then unmute yourself and speak. Another is to use the little button at the bottom, which allows you to put a little white hand up in the corner, raise hand, lower hand function. That's a little hard to see for me, but my co-host might be able to catch that. And the third way is to submit a question in chat, which my co-host will try to monitor. So Terry Offord has had his hand up for a while. Why don't you go ahead? And unmute yourself, Terry. Terry, you have to unmute.
First, I want to really thank Peggy and Kim and Gail. I thought all 3 of them made really excellent and informative comments. One of the issues that was kind of indirectly touched on by both Gail and Kim is a larger context. So affordable housing is an objective, but there are other potential objectives, the quality of life objectives, green spaces, aesthetics of the structures. If there's going to be a higher concentration, then increasing the walkability, the bicycleability. If you're going to omit if you're going to allow on-street parking, then how does that affect this higher density where people are trying to walk and so forth? So one comment or issue, I think, is to have a broader context of what all of the key factors are, not just affordability and that sort of thing, but more of the quality of life, aesthetic issues that are also important. And then I think if we're going to criticize the current approach, maybe we could come up with some specific gotcha examples. What's to prevent somebody from basically building a dormitory and just, if putting kind of a super Airbnb where people can just come in and stay overnight and you just put in little bunk beds or something like that. So I think there's just a lot of broader dimensions here that ought to be documented in some way.
Is there a question in there anywhere?
Well, the question would be, is there any effort going on to broaden the context of the goals? In other words, explicitly, not just affordability, but also the things that I was just trying to bring up, the aesthetics and so on, the green space. How do we ensure enough green spaces? How do we ensure enough quality of the aesthetics of way things look. And people are building little ADUs on their property. You know, what is that doing to the aesthetics of the neighborhood?
Okay, who would like to address that?
I'll start and say there's nothing public going on to address those things comprehensively. And from my perspective, there has not been the opportunity for a community-wide conversation to come to to find common ground, because I think that many people who actually live here as opposed to developers I think we share the same goals, and there's some that you mentioned, Terry. From my perspective, having a genuine extended conversation, including our city government leaders, but also, other members of the community, is very important, and it hasn't happened. I've been paying attention to this for 2 years, and it unfortunately just hasn't happened. I think that the larger context is also important, because the fact that this is a very, very small town with a very, very, very large university, 75,000 students at UF and Santa Fe compared to a population of 134,000 is, I believe, unique in the nation. And so the challenges that we have with how accessory dwelling units, which are a perfectly fine idea, one to a site owner occupied even in this town, but the way it's being developed will play out differently here than the way it would play out in other places that don't have our particular context. And I don't think that has been addressed at all.
If I could just add one quick thing very quickly. Another aspect that maybe isn't being done, although I think it was just briefly kind of indirectly alluded to, is what are the best practices elsewhere? I can make a lot of trips to Europe, and I see it seems like they're far more capable than we are about providing affordable housing in a nice way. And so I'm wondering if we could identify some best practices either in this country or overseas and bring those up and say, why can't we do as well? Or why can't we incorporate some of the attributes of the best practices?
Okay, does anybody else have a question?
We have a chat question from Martha Davis to Gail. How does the Trump era stimulus zone relate to the developers' initiatives in town, such as the student housing on Seminary Lane?
So if we're talking about the opportunity zones, I am not aware of any funds from opportunity zones that developers have used. That's not to say that it's not possible or that it hasn't happened. I'm just not aware of it. I do know that Commissioner Simmons is interested. Most of the opportunity zones lie in her district, in District 1. And I know that she seems to be in favor of opportunity zones, and that's discussion that the commission is having relatively soon. And what that means for our city, what that means for development, and what it means just generally. Because I don't think a lot of us have a clear understanding about how opportunity zones and whatever funding there is available fits into the overall plan.
If I can just add that I'm not sure that, there may be city funds that can be contributed within opportunity zones, but I think that the advantage is the tax relief that developers get. So it basically cuts out the government, and it makes these appealing because they reduce, I think, federal income taxes or whatever taxes they pay. So I think it's sort of seen as an easy way for cities to get something to happen without having to kick in much is how I understand.
Okay, I would like to take this opportunity to welcome Tristan Wood, who has joined us. He's a reporter with the Independent Florida Alligator. And hopefully we'll give some exposure to this in part due to the failure of the major local newspaper to do that since Andrew Kaplan left and went to South Carolina. Mr. Rosenblum, you have a question?
Does anybody have an idea about the demand for retirees to move to Gainesville, University of Florida especially, alumni, to return to Gainesville and live in these new apartments? I know that in my hometown of Madison, Wisconsin, this is a great demand. People are moving back to Madison, purchasing apartments in the new high-rise developments around the campus. And Madison's experience may provide, Madison is very much like Gainesville. The size of the community, the size of the university, and the attraction of the university for the alumni to move back. I've even thought of that if it wasn't for the blasted winters.
Mr. Rosenblum, I could speak to that too, because what we find in Gainesville so far is the market driver and the profit incentive is for developers to build high-rise, not condominiums, not luxury condominiums, but student apartments where there's 3, 5, or bedrooms around a common area, and the students pay by the bedroom. And in the Standard, for example, which is one of the largest one on the corner, 13th Street and University Avenue, reportedly 1/2 of a 2-bedroom apartment goes for about $1,100 a month. That's not affordable housing, and it's not for people that are coming to purchase anything. It's just transitory rentals, and that seems to be what we're getting with Seminary Lane, what we're getting with the building that's going to go up in place of the Swamp Restaurant. And of course, down further on 13th Street, where there's at least 3 or 4 projects in progress and one completed. So, I would love to see some incentive for more condominiums to be built that people would like to live in a more dense area. I spent 18 years in Seoul, Korea, where that was the norm. And my wife still misses that. But anybody else would like to speak to that question?
We do have another question, but Commissioner Johnson has let us know that she has to leave in just a couple of minutes.
Okay.
And actually, I have 2 quick questions, which you may not want to answer, that have political undertones to them.
Could I hold that just a moment since she's leaving? I want to be sure and thank you, Commissioner, for joining us. And Rich Doty, I would like you to share your screen and show her the chart that you've produced that shows just in our neighborhood the number of homesteaded properties versus non-homesteaded properties. Can you explain that real quick?
Sure. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
So this is the first of a series of maps we'll be putting on UPNA's website and Facebook page. And this shows homesteaded residential properties in green, non-homesteaded residential properties in red, and then the properties that are not shaded are either not residential or they're residential, but they don't have a housing unit on them.
That's the Lutheran Church and the United Church and Parker Elementary School. But we found also that there's over 200 absentee landlords just in our neighborhood, and about 47 of those are corporations. And right behind one of our board members, there's a 6-bedroom, 4-bath, 2 units on a single family lot with a common driveway and a common fence that we weren't able to prevent happening in the neighborhood. So this is the cheese picture that shows the impact on our neighborhood. Thank you, Rich.
Absolutely. And we have a lot of data associated with these parcels. So we can click on an individual parcel and see all kinds of spreadsheet type attribute information about that parcel. And we're going to be using this moving forward to track a lot of things from code violations and membership and all kinds of stuff like that.
So Commissioner Johnson, I wanted you to see that, and we can provide more information. Rich is probably the foremost expert in the state of Florida on this kind of data collection.
Thanks, Bob.
Fantastic. Yes, that's good information. Thank you. Is there any I can answer before I hop off really quick? I see something in the chat.
Yeah, there's a bunch in the chat.
There was one
I think that is
question.
about what's next. Based on your experiences, what do you see as next steps to address the facts at hand? I will say before I hop off that I see you all continuing to be involved. So the last commission meeting, we said that there's going to be a robust community engagement process, specifically around exclusionary zoning and inclusionary zoning at a minimum. So I would just kind of look out for that. Many of us kind of talk regularly. Certainly many of you all stay involved. So I would just, I would continue to, if some of you all are displeased with what is happening, I would continue to express that displeasure. I would ask that we also come together around some solutions that you see outside of what the commission has come up with to address displacement and gentrification and affordable housing. And so any kind of solutions that you have, please reach out to us and let us know that this is something that should be included in our affordable housing strategic plan. If there are any kind of, we're also updating our comprehensive plan. That's going to be at least a year-long process. And this is for the next decade. So there's also going to be another robust community engagement process happening around that, which is going to have ramifications for development in Gainesville. So I would say also to just, keep your ear to the ground about that and those, whatever happens around that community engagement, and stay involved in that. That's my 2 cents for now. And I just want to say thank you all for having me. It was nice to be able to put faces with names from emails that I've gotten from you all. So thank you. Feel free to reach out to me at my email address. I put it in the chat. And also, I'll also put in my cell phone number in case you all have any questions. I do love, if you all do want to email me, call me, please just send me a heads up text beforehand so that I will pick up the phone. We all know with the election, all the calls that we're getting these days. So that's it. Thank you all for having me. I'm going to end with putting my phone number in the chat.
All right, thank you very much for your
Thank you.
advocacy and your good work. All right, Abe, you said there was some other. Have we covered that?
I had questions actually that Commissioner Johnson might address, but you probably don't have time. So one of them is you alluded to the role of the university, and I wonder how strong a factor the university desire to basically turn our particular neighborhood and some contiguous neighborhoods into large student housing areas is, and how significant is that as a factor in what's going on? That is the university as a policy driver.
You're asking me, am I off mute? I think that it is, I think it's the biggest driver, and I think I'm probably underestimating the driver that it is. And that is because I am 100% certain that decisions are made in rooms that I am not in rooms that many of us are not in, about the development of this community and what it's going to look like in a decade and in 2 decades. I'm certain that the plan is there. And now it's about how to realize that plan. I do think that there are a huge driver in this, and what to do about that. I have some ideas. I'm being recorded right now, so I won't say them. But I think that we should, that should be on our list is US making sure that they're contributing more ways than they are right now. I think it's huge. So I'm going to end with that because I'm taking my daughter somewhere. Thank you all for having me, and feel free to just reach out if you all have any more questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, bye.
There is a question in the chat from Jeffrey King for Professors Carr and Tanzer. The state of Florida requires an environmental resource permit be obtained for new development. Stormwater management is one element in this permit. is relatively small scale infill development such as one ADU on an already developed property subject to this permit process? And will the increase in stormwater runoff due to the relatively small scale increase in impervious area tax our creeks and aquifers?
Let me jump in here. First of all, Jeffrey, I apologize for not responding to your email earlier. When I mentioned this the other evening at the board meeting, I mentioned it because it's a concern that was expressed, as I said, during the phone-in for the ADU ordinance. And I also think it has the potential to be substantive and could help with some sort of a legal challenge, but we haven't explored it. It's my understanding that fundamentally old single family neighborhoods have been exempt from trying to deal with stormwater. And I think that this is something that definitely needs exploration. If you have any expertise or ideas about this, I surely would wish we can get in touch and discuss it, because we'd like to try to build some facts as it relates to the potential for problems with stormwater resulting from the higher density.
Okay.
And I would just add to that, that it's not just stormwater. There are other infrastructure issues that are not considered in adding density in single family neighborhoods, and probably other places as well. But potable water and wastewater and electric capacity and street capacity, all kinds of things are not being considered in the aggregate. So if you add one ADU to one house in one neighborhood, it's no problem. If you add, 4 or 5 in a neighborhood, probably not a problem. But if you start to increase the density in pretty much entire neighborhoods, which might likely happen now, and with more to come if new housing types are brought back into the picture. I know from our experience in Gulfview that our infrastructure, our utilities, which were put in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, were woefully inadequate. And that would be true even more so, especially for some of our Eastern friends who were shortchanged in a big way the first time infrastructure was put in Gainesville.
Okay, it's 10 after 5. Does anybody else have anything further? All right, I'm just going to conclude this program session with a couple of comments. At the last public hearing City Commission had earlier, I guess it was already Tuesday of this week, long session in the afternoon. I did call in, and of course UPNA had previously unanimously recommended that there should be a moratorium. We limited it to 6 months because that's what they did in Chapel Hill and North Carolina. And it was legally defensible. And I've previously given the commission a tightly worded, what I think as a retired attorney is the basic gist for a ordinance that would simply do that for up to 6 months in the certain designated areas, and tied it to the provision in the Land Development Code, which talks without mentioning race, but it talks about protecting neighborhoods with a special character, culture, history, architectural, vintage or anything like that, and to consider that in making development decisions. And to me, the problem with Seminary Lane is that planning staff just blew right through that and didn't consider that at all. It's in the objectives purpose section of the code. And Sean McDermott, Assistant City Attorney, made his argument that that was just what the 2017 Commission's intent was when they passed the Comprehensive Plan and Land Development Code back then, but it's not really part of the rules affecting the developers. And I've told the attorney representing the Seminary Lane petitioners that that should be seen as the gateway through which this luxury student apartment complex should never have passed, period. And then you talk about density and bedrooms and setbacks and all of those rules. But so he has made that argument. The administrative judge may just find that that's what lawyers call hortatory, not mandatory. But one of the ways to put teeth in the code is to actually put teeth in the code and make that a mandatory consideration. The last thing was that Gail Johnson on 31 August at the General Policy Committee meeting, one of the things she proposed it for, instead of by right developments for everything with intermediate and major development plans, there should be a public hearing. Not just staff review like Seminary Lane, but there should be a public hearing, either the plan board, the development review board, and ultimately to the city commission. Well, evidently they didn't want to do that. They voted it down 5-2. And that's one that can be reversed because there are other organizations in Fifth Avenue, for example, called the Gainesville Alliance for Equitable Development that had to hire an attorney. They had to look up, find a plaintiff, and sue and spend a lot of money. And speaking of that, Janice Gary's address, Garry, who's taken money and donations to pay for those legal costs and transcript, attorney's fees. It's Janice Gary, 925 Northwest 14th Avenue, Gainesville, 32601. And any amount would be appreciated. The expenses are high. The transcript alone is $24,000, split 3 ways between the petitioners, the city, and Trammell Webb. So that's just one area where we can contribute. So I'm going to conclude this portion now. And Terry, you've had the floor long enough. We're going to go off recording and we're going to begin with the next portion of our meeting shortly, unless anybody has something.
Bob, can I just suggest that we let other people know about the new Gainesville Neighborhoods United organization and website?
Yeah, Peggy and Cam and I meet earlier today. You want to quickly address that?
Well, there are a group of concerned citizens from across the city, not just University Park Neighborhood Association. We are coalescing around the idea of creating a new organization called Gainesville Neighborhoods United. Initially, our efforts are going to focus on public relations and trying to inform citizenry, but also we hope to promote the notion of celebrating our neighborhoods and protecting them. And through that group, we hope to keep everyone across the city much better informed. It's so far it's in its infancy, and we will more to follow, I would say. Kim, do you want to join in? And thank you, Kim, very much for your excellent presentation, let me say.
Thanks, everybody. Enjoy your business meeting.
Yeah, thank you very much, both of you. We appreciate it very much.
Bye-bye.
A lot of good comments in chat. All right.